And maybe on that note, Jonathan, I think it's kind of 3 minutes past 11. Should we start? And obviously, all friends in the room, welcome. Really lovely to see everybody. Just a few housekeeping things before we start. So my name's Kerry Frankson. I'm a Daphne Jackson Research Fellow at the Centre, and I've been working with Jonathan on this series. And just before we begin, just to remind people that we are filming this event. So please, if you'd rather turn your cameras off, but we will be recording. Also, what we'll do is the speakers will speak for around an hour. And that will be led by Jonathan. And then in the last half an hour, we'll open up to Q&A. Please feel free to pop things in the chat. We'll keep a track of that as we go along. Equally, at the end, if you'd like to put your cameras on and ask the questions yourself, that's equally just as possible. So we can just gauge that as we go along. But thank you all for being here, and I'll hand over to Jonathan.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. So welcome to everybody who's joined us to watch and listen. My name's Jonathan Burrows, and I'm a choreographer and an associate professor at the Centre for Dance Research, Coventry University. Kerry, do you want to introduce yourself very briefly before I go on?
I did, yeah. So Kerry Frankson, Daphne Jackson Research Fellow at the Centre.
So let me introduce our 3 guests. So Rosemary Lee, Ramsay Burt, and Kate Ledger. And perhaps I could ask you 3 to just briefly introduce yourselves and say a little bit about your backgrounds and what your current research is and or artistic practices are. Rosie, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Rosemary Lee, or known as Rosie in this context. I'm a choreographer and a filmmaker, and I'm also an associate professor at DaRE, like Jonathan. And just a little bit about what I do and my background. I'm East Anglian, which I think has some bearing on this, big skies and edges. And I graduated from the Laban Center in 1981 and went to New York through the early 80s. I have been making live work since then, since the 80s, and then film work from the 90s. My live work tends to be outdoors at different times of the day with different kinds of casts and very different sites. And my film work is often installation-based, multi-screen, and sometimes on a loop, so it's sort of a durational experience. What else can I say? My training is at the Laban Center. I've obviously come from a sort of ballet and Cunningham and Graham background, but in the 80s moved into more release-based work and improvisational practices, which really influenced the work I make now. I think that's enough.
Ramsay, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Ramsay Burt. I'm retired. I was a professor of dance history at De Montfort. And my background, I initially did a degree in fine art and art history, and started writing about dance for New Dance magazine. Started writing about more experimental dance, and a friend suggested I did a PhD, which I then became my first book, which is Male Dancer. I was always interested in the 60s because I was 15 in 1968, old enough to know what was going on, but too young to be able to be involved in it. And so I did a lot of research into Judson because of it being in the 60s. And I should say that I kind of discovered more experimental dance going to a Dartington festival, where I very early on, there was Steve Paxton. So almost one of my very early dance classes was contact improvisation with Steve Paxton, and also Mary Fulkerson. And so a kind of introduction to what those practices that we, for want of a better word, call somatic. And I was interested in the connection between that and Judson. And I'm retired. In my retirement, I wanted to do more drawing, because my first degree was in fine art, improve my French, and I'm just about to go to France to do a course, a 2-week French course, and play the piano and more. And Kate is my teacher. So if that's a good sort of link.
Yes. Kate, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Kate Ledger. I'm a pianist, piano teacher. My specialism is experimental music, but specifically since doing my PhD about 6 years ago, it has very much focused on the embodiment of performance and how we can use, or how I can use, the way I move in experimental practice. And so I do a lot of work with composers. I collaborate a lot, and I have a body of work that is made in collaboration with various different composers, where the way I move and the way I use the moment in performance is the feature of the music, if you see what I mean. So it's moving beyond sound a little bit. However, it does often keep coming back to sound. And I'm currently playing the last 4 piano works of Morton Feldman, experimental composer from the New York School. And I've done 2, and I have 2 more to go. We're spreading them across the entire year. I'm working with another person on curating the concerts. And I suppose what this is allowing me to do at the minute is to come back to sound, but to really be aware of how my body perhaps takes maybe more of a back seat, but is still very much present and is very much wholeheartedly involved in the production of my sound. And so I'm unpicking sort of the layers of that at the minute in the way that I perform. But experimental music, music of John Cage, of Feldman, Christian Wolff in particular, they really do give you that platform in which to explore how we embody sound. So that's me.
Thanks, Kate. So just to come back to to give you a bit of context for this talk, it's part of a series which actually has been ongoing over a number of years called DaRE Invites. And this year, the overarching subject is the body and time. Each year, the series is focused on a different relationship of the idea of physicality or the body. So this year we're looking at time. So last week we had a talk which focused on the what we called the split second before improvising. And this week we're going to look at what I called reflective time. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure what I mean by reflective time, and maybe that's something that we can discuss. But Ramsay, when you mentioned the importance of your meeting with an experience of somatic work at Dartington College in the 1970s and 80s, then it occurs to me that there has been a strong relationship between somatic work and what I'm calling reflective time. But also, Ramsay, you and Kate both mentioned Judson Church, the composers Christian Wolff, John Cage, Morton Feldman. Cage influenced Judson pre the somatic moment, or at a time when it was less present, and so there's a kind of overlap there between dance and music practices, and certainly it's clear that the music of Cage, Wolff, and Feldman invites this reflective response from the listener. So could I begin by asking each of you to say just a little about what my term reflective time in performance might mean to you, whether it's the right term, whether you would maybe suggest a different term, whether you would maybe suggest an overlap of terms, and how that kind of work, which I'm trying to approach, might manifest itself through your own practices, so through your scholarly work, through your performance work, through your philosophical positioning, and so forth. Ram, did you want to start?
I was, and somebody who'd always been quite important for me was Susanne Langer, who talked about music creating time, and the experience of music actually I suppose she was a cellist, and so perhaps she's talking about the experience of actually playing. I certainly find that music, almost more than dance, can have a kind of effect. But also, if we're talking about Judson and the composers around Cage, with Kate, one of the things she started me playing was some Morton Feldman, and one of the things I found was the particular touch that your fingers have on the piano in a more experimental work is just doesn't work with the way you play Brahms or romantic music, and that it very much makes you aware of the physicality of what you're doing. So and it's because experimental work perhaps creates a sense of time that doesn't fit a kind of normal way of experiencing time. It kind of it just doesn't fit, and it makes you makes you aware that there might be an alternative. I know you're talking about reflective time. I know that later in this series of talks, you've got Yves Citon, who talked about the economy of attention and a critique of the way that a kind of internet-based, AI-driven kind of experience of time leads people in a certain way, and whether kind of experimental work, almost if you come with that kind of rhythm to it, then you just can't make sense of it, and so you have to find something else. And or going back to the piano, you're actually made more aware of the physicality of what you're doing because you have to think about it. And I kind of connected that with Judson. And I was also aware that Steve Paxton, I'd once asked him when I was doing research into Judson, and I was interested in, I'd found out that Leroy Jones, Amira Biraka, went to Judson and wrote about it, and that Cecil Taylor, the bebop pianist, went to Judson and played for one of the concerts. So I said, "Oh, were you at all? What about kind of Black people in Judson, African Americans?" And he said, "Oh, I wasn't listening to jazz. I was listening to John Cage and Morton Feldman and Christian Wolff and people like that." And you realize he danced in pieces with music by Feldman. So maybe I saw a connection that way. So one of the things I felt really exciting working with Kate was the connection between the work I'd been researching in dance history and suddenly a kind of music of the period that seems to correspond in some ways to those kind of concerns about a radical and perhaps slightly disruptive way of approaching the body and time. How's that? Will that do?
Thank you, Ramsay. Rosie, do you have any responses to that, or can you say a little bit about your own position in relation to this idea of reflective time, whether that makes sense to you, how you might have engaged and continue to engage with work that invites that response?
God, it's so expansive, isn't it? The thought of this. So I'll do my best to be as specific as I can, but every time I think about it, something else occurs to me that seems to fit. So I'll do my best. When you asked us what do we understand by the idea of reflective time, I realized how hard that was. And it seems a bit simplistic, but for me, it's almost as if time is no longer connected to time's arrow, which is what most of our life is about, sort of going forward. So the word forward makes no sense to me in reflective time. So some of those words about moving on in measured time in a direction forwards doesn't seem to make sense. So it feels almost as if time is a gas around you and in you. And maybe because of that, almost an atmosphere, that makes sense when Ramsay talks about touch and the moment the skin touches the key and the sense of the knowingness and the awareness in that moment of the touch of the finger on the key for the note that is, going to pierce that gassy time that is created by the gaps between the notes. That feels very present in the somatic kind of practice for me in the 70s, early 80s. That I experienced, where having been a ballet, been doing ballet as a child and then Cunningham, everything is measured in time and you are dancing through that measurement to those counts. And as soon as you take the counts away, you're experiencing the attentiveness of your experience of movement changes. That's what it feels like to me. And I'm not dissing music to counts. I feel like I'm going back there in my old age and rather loving it. It's more that at that period we were exploring how to reach one's awareness more and more fully, almost at a cellular level, so that we could feel everything that was happening to us. And in that sense, it felt like you were creating time in order to sense it, if that makes sense. So that's my sort of experience of being a dancer in it and of experiencing those kinds of techniques. I hope people who are listening understand what those are. We shouldn't assume. I called them release, but it's some somatic practices that were beginning around those times and very linked to the things that Ramsay has said and the practitioners. But then I think I need to add something that came to me this morning, because another way of thinking about reflective time for me and in my work is the way you can't separate time from landscape, and how being outdoors is about being in time somehow, and you're experiencing all the different living things and inanimate things in their time scales. So from an ant and its quick rushing energy and short lifespan to a rock, to the tide of the sea, all those different kind of cyclical and different ways of being in the world in time somehow conjure for you a very different feeling of yourself, I feel. So my work is often outdoors, and I think it's related to that, to those senses of different times. But then just to finish, I was also, as well as being influenced by Cunningham, Cage, and then very particularly Arvo Part, that came out of that practice, I suppose. I would like to say then there's people like Philip Glass, where the work is not so much about the space between the notes, but about the flow of the notes and the speed of them, which also sends you into a reflective space. So hence my sense of, goodness me, this is complex. So something like Einstein on the Beach that's 5 hours long, and the work of Wilson in Robert Wilson, who directed it, that also sends me into a reflective space and makes me think about duration of performance. So I think I should stop, but there's a lot in there. Is that enough? Yeah, I think it's enough for now.
Yeah, maybe at some point we could. You made a really interesting distinction there between this image of time in experimental music and somatic work, which isolates, which is able to isolate moments and therefore give the sense of creating time, or the experience of Philip Glass and Robert Wilson, or forms of ritual music or club music, which use repeating beats in order to arrive at a similar sense of time expanding and physical reflection. Maybe that's something it hadn't occurred to. I'd been thinking more about the first description. It hadn't occurred to me that there are different modes of arriving at that reflection, but maybe we can come back to that. Kate, did you want to say a few words about what your relationship to the idea of reflective time might be, whether you choose a different description? Maybe you could say a little more about this physical aspect of performing music.
Yeah, for sure. I suppose the first thing I just want to sort of check in with is, are we considering a sense of time from a performer's perspective or an audience's? Because I suppose those two things are, certainly in my experience, are very different, but also very mutual, where there's a sort of mutual understanding there. And I think a lot of this relates to what it is, say if it's from my point of view as the performer, the type of task that I have to do very much determines the sense of time. And all this can exist within the same piece of music, let alone the same composer or whatever. And so when I was thinking about what would I think of as being reflective time, I suppose what emerged was this idea of being in a performance where I'm able to almost step out of myself for a moment and almost reflect, say, well, what's just happened? What's the trace of what's just happened? And how is that going to inform what I do next? And so it becomes a lot of my work has led me to do lots of meditation practice and to consider lots of this idea of playing in presence. And that really kind of, because I was noticing this way of being in performance where actually I'm not just thinking about the next thing. I am able to just kind of almost like observe what's just happened. And in order to do that in performance, I think you have to separate the two selves. You have to just become the observing self rather than the kind of like active self. But only certain music gives you that, there's only certain moments in music gives you that space to actually do that. And so I think a lot of Feldman, in terms of the very expansive Feldman, where we have lots of repetition or we have lots of gaps, lots of rests, lots of empty bars. Although I always say to Ramsay, those bars are not empty. They're still, a lot of the time we are still in time. We are still beating. It's not just abstract. And that's what kind of always maintains the forward arrow. But within that, this forward arrow can kind of maybe just bleed outwards. And I have time to step outside and continue counting, but from over here. So I find that the kind of spectrum within one piece of music really interesting. Because then the next Feldman I'm going to play is a piece called Piano, and it's it's from the 70s, so it's not as late in his career, but it is one of the 4 last piano works he wrote, and that is completely rhythmic, completely very strict compared to say other compositions, and it requires probably lots and lots of just moving forward in it. There's probably much less space to kind of step back and be reflective. He'll give like just a little bit, and then actually it becomes a colour, or it becomes an energy, and he starts to play with energies. How close or how far away am I from this reflection? So that's kind of what came to me, but very much linking with lots of meditation practice for me. That's where things have gone recently.
Rosie and Kate, you both spoke about long duration. Could we maybe just for a moment, I wonder if anybody has any of the three of you has any thoughts about, is there a relationship between long duration and the arrival at reflective time? I'm aware that Cage's piece was 4 minutes 33 seconds. This wasn't long duration, and yet was a marker for the suggestion of creating a space out of time where the listener opens themselves to everything that's happening, which is the absence of the piano happening. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, Rosie or Kate.
Shall I go, Kate? I really loved listening to you speak then. You're so articulate about what's happening. That's so interesting, thinking about that Cage piece and absence, and therefore the expansion of time, what feels like the expansion of time, the living and dwelling in time for the audience member, even though it is measured. So I was thinking about sort of measurement and you as a musician counting through silences, whereas for dancers, I'm going to tell an anecdote. I was once in an improvisation class in New York where we had to dance 1 minute solos, and the person leading it, I think it was Lisa Krauss, possibly, from the Trisha Brown Company, had a timer, but we didn't. So we had to improvise for a minute, and most people were wildly off, but I was always dead on, which I was very chuffed about. But I wasn't counting in a metered sense. What I would do is go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I'd still get there. And so I sort of loved that sense as a dancer, and then maybe as a choreographer, of pulling time around within a very short time frame. And maybe the somatic practices also enable us as dancers, in terms of the experience now as the performer, not the audience, to dwell even in the teeniest bit of a moment before an arm goes up, like the dwelling in the touch of the finger to the piano key. Maybe the somatic practices enable us to do that within very small time frames. And then lastly, yes, I do think long being present at long art forms and folk forms. I'm very sorry if my notifications are bleeping away. I really apologize if you can hear that. For example, the Obios in Cornwall, which starts at 10 and ends at 10 in the evening, or Abbots Bromley Horn Dance. I've been to both of those events twice now. They put me in a very different place because of the inevitability of it going on and on and on. And because of the on and on and onness, that gives me a way of dwelling in time. So I think you can dwell in the second and in the hours. And I think that's what I'm interested in when I make work.
Yes, I've been down in Padstow together with Rosie, and then if you don't know about that that kind of traditional event, it takes place always on May the 1st. But there are hundreds and hundreds of people, members of two parties. They're called the Blue Os and the Red Os, and they sing the same song all day long, over and over and over again. And the first time you hear it, you burst into tears. It's profoundly affecting, and through the day, the emotional power of the shared song accumulates. I just wanted to add that. Kate, did you have some thoughts in those directions about is it long duration? Can it be short duration? Is there a symbiotic link between reflective time and long duration, or can it be accessed in short spasms of felt time?
I think so, because I think it's all to do with it's all relative, and I think so. I've done quite a few durational things. I did a 7-hour piano piece that was streamed live on YouTube that didn't have a lot going on in it. It was quite sort of simple, quite still, but it was just long. And after a period of time, after say maybe 4 hours or something, I started to fatigue, and only for just fatigue, just because just sitting in my posture. I sort of had methods of kind of managing it and dealing with it, and it was okay. But I think what made it really interesting as a piece was the fact that the last couple of hours were kind of fought for, and I think my sense of time was just getting longer and longer, right? But I think in terms of, there was something about it happened during lockdown, and I remember one reflection that somebody said was that it was really kind of they were working and they sort of tuned in when I started, and then they had to leave, and then they came back later and I was still going, and they turned the screen back on and they noticed that the light in the room had changed, and they were just, even when that sense of passing time, like a day had passed and I was still there, and they just found the idea of that very kind of tragic and therefore kind of beautiful. And I think it was just the sort of knowledge of somebody's doing something for that period of time was kind of enough. It wasn't like they had to be there in the room, they didn't have to be watching me the whole time. So that was quite interesting. But then I think with 4 minutes 33, for example, certainly at the time, it feels like a long time, just that piece, because there's expectations. Certainly at the time, there's expectations from the audience. It's for a piano, and so there's somebody sat at a piano, and we sit there, and I can imagine it being quite excruciating the first time that was performed. But then I think when nowadays people are open to the piece and actually sink into it, and once you start sinking into it and accept this is what's going to happen for 4 minutes 33, time expands, and you're starting to listen, and actually it becomes shorter again. So I think it's all to do with who's listening, I suppose, and how, the context of whatever piece of time it is that we're presenting.
Ramsay, do you have any thoughts about the relationship between reflection and duration?
Yeah, I suppose I can think of long pieces that I've seen. I seem to remember a vague memory of a piece that went on for 24 hours, and so we went back to see it 3 or 4 times, and that sense of it of it's still going on, and the difference between the time in the room, in the performance space, and the time outside that we'd just been, whatever we'd been doing. I suppose I do think of duration, my memory experience of durational work being kind of pushed back into well, okay, what are you going to do? And maybe the kind of sense of am I sitting properly? Am I going to get stiff shoulders? So I suppose that's a moment. I suppose that's reflective, but it's also aesthetic, and it's an aesthetic that is a challenge to other other ways of doing things, or reminding you that there are different ways of experiencing time from the ways that, you know, that Facebook or scrolling social media wants you. The kind of was it Rosie, you talked about the arrow, time's winged arrow. So that's all I really have to think of. You know, that kind of physicality that you then find. I had the experience of the last piece that Kate played, Palais de Marie, and I got the score and I tried to sight read it, and having heard her playing it, so I kind of knew what it was, and saw that actually counting it, because it has these bars in one time with notes in, and then a different time signature for the gap, and it was very confusing to try and kind of work that out, apart from actually just getting the notes and so on. And it took me about half an hour. I think it's not a very long piece, and certainly at the end of it, it was a kind of it was a kind of meditative sort of state, you know, that you ended up in, that the music had somehow offered, you know, because you don't have to accept. So I suppose, yeah, those are my thoughts about it.
When you were talking then, Ramsay, I was remembering that Lauren Scott, who was part of the talk on split-second timing, she's comes from hip-hop. She's a popper, and I'd been working with her just recently, and we were talking about her relationship to music when she dances, when she's popping, and we observed that it's not really that the dance is merely following the music, which I think is what a kind of common misconception of the experience of dancing to music, but that in fact the way she uses the hits in popping or changing mode in popping actually alters what I hear that the music is doing. So there's a kind of there's an invitation for the audience to reflectively reorganize what they thought that the music was doing, and that hadn't occurred to me before. And of course, that is happening in a very, very rapidly in most forms of hip hop dance, and certainly in popping. Could we just come back?
Just say, I've been talking about kind of experimental work that's quite meditative, but there's also raves, you know, which also are durational and are full of that kind of pulse, and yet they also can have that kind of letting go and experiencing something differently.
Can I say something? I thought that was so great that Ramsay said the word challenge, because it's so easy to think when we use terms like reflective and meditative that there's something about sort of easy and not, you know, sort of comfortable almost. And, you know, Cage was absolutely disrupting, and all those, you know, disrupting how we thought of and felt performance, time, physicality. And so there is a sense, and that lovely thing that you said about, am I sitting properly? That sort of self-awareness that is the awkward self-awareness. I think it's important for us to remember that it's not somatic practice and release is about finding comfort and ease, but it was also very challenging against a codified, measured way of moving before it. So I think it's worth remembering these challenges of durational work and what we're talking, and reflective work. And also I've I always think that my work might be easy for an audience, and then I was reminded by a press officer who was trying to market the work that actually was extremely difficult for people to let go into the gentleness and non-conflict of what I was making. And it just made me think ease is often very hard for people. If that's what we're trying to, if we're trying to get them to dwell somewhere and let go, that's not easy. I just wanted to say that.
The first time I saw Merce Cunningham, the Merce Cunningham Company perform was in Edinburgh in 1980, and they were presenting sorry, I've gone out of my head what they called them, these mashups of different pieces that lasted for 2 hours. He had a name. Events. It's very obvious, sorry. And they were in a gymnasium. It was very hardcore. I mean, I was 20. I'd never really experienced anything like it, but at some point after more than an hour, there was this hammering, and then I realized it was underneath the seating bank, and then somebody stood up and lifted their flip chair, and I saw John Cage with a hammer, and he was going underneath people's seats banging, and the person who stood up said, "Go away, you silly man." But it was obviously a very different call to attention within this very demanding reflective time created by the performance. I wanted to come back to something Kate said at the very beginning, which was about, are we talking about the experience of the performer or the audience? We've said, each of you have said a little bit about perhaps your own experiences as audience. But I wonder what your thoughts are. Could we go a little bit deeper into that question? What can this kind of altered time offer to an audience? What things might we get wrong in the assumption that we're offering that time to an audience? What experiences do you have as a performer, leading or inviting an audience, or as an audience member? You know, when does it work? Do we perhaps sometimes say, yes, this is a reflective time, this is a meditative piece, but in fact it's not functioning when not together in the room? Kate, do you want to pick up on that, because it was your question originally?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's one that I keep coming back to whenever I sort of think about if I'm writing something about what I do. It's, well, hang on a minute, who's this for? Is this for me, or is it for an audience? And it's like, how, you know, all these wonderful things that I kind of think it's about isn't necessarily the case for anyone who's listening. And so I suppose something that I kind of I guess I didn't realize I'd made this decision, but it was when I was chatting to somebody who was doing their research was about atmosphere, and they wanted to kind of pick at what do we mean by atmosphere, and can we kind of, like, you know, sort of do some sort of experiment to measure atmosphere, you know, this kind of stuff. And the first stage for her was to interview performers and ask them, you know, how do you regard the audience, you know, and, you know, like, certainly when you're playing, like, how is your relationship with them? How, you know, how do you perform, you know, how does it affect the decisions that you make in performance when there's an audience there? And the way that I sort of answered was, well, I see it as a team. It's like, well, we're all here to admire this moment, right? It's like there's something's going to occur in the next 30 minutes or whatever that we all want to hear. We're all here for the same reason, and it's a team. And so my job is to make the sound, and to sort of do my best to, you know, give this version of this piece here and now, and then the rest is up. Then it's like, and then you're part of this. It's like, so, and you have to listen to it, and how you do that is completely personal, individual. And so I suppose the way that I then make decisions as a performer is, you know, there's a huge sort of there's a huge, what's the word, like in terms of performance practices in experimental music, there's quite a bit of there's an understanding that, you know, the performer should not get in the way of the music, and that the music, the composition specifically, should be kind of as neutral as possible, you know, hands off, because this thing is amazing, don't touch it too much because you might damage it. So that's always sort of been on my shoulders for my teachers. I studied with Philip Thomas, who's probably one of the greatest experimental pianists, up there with David Tudor, I would say. And that was what he taught me. But then the teamwork's gone, and I feel like if we're not too careful, the performer can actually become, it's like it's something that's sort of bigger and better than all of us, and actually the composition is part of that teamwork. And so I've really worked on trying to create this sort of blend of everything, and it's, you know, and I'm very much valuing the fact that we are all individuals in this, and that there's like there's different ways of doing things. So I suppose, yeah, we're sort of thinking about the audience. I'm hoping that by just kind of finding an approach that is appropriate for, you know, that performance, that event, you know, that there's an understanding that, you know, this is what it is, and that it's open, it's an invitation for sure. That what you said about the popping, it's like I love that. It's like it's an invitation to reorganize what you hear. It's like the way that I perform this will hopefully allow you to maybe just sort of hear something differently. I think that's exactly it. It's like, what can I show you in this piece? Yeah, so I hope that makes sense. And it is something I'm thinking about at the minute, and so I'm still kind of forming ideas about it, really.
Ramsay, did you have any thoughts about audience?
Yes, I suppose I have the experience of taking people to see work that I think is going to be great, and being totally thrown by it, and realizing, you know, maybe the kind of inside knowledge, particularly in dance, actually. So our audience, and then there's kind of like sociological studies of audience, you know, audience questionnaires and analysis of the data. And I find audience that kind of quantitative approach to audience or quite difficult. And then that notion of, well, what is the specialist knowledge that gives you access to things, and then is it possible to get something without that specialist knowledge? I don't know. But then there's kind of being in an audience who, you know, it's totally there, and being in an audience that's restless. So I suppose I know those kind of, I can recognize those kind of experiences, and being in an audience where I feel I've connected with the performers, perhaps because I know them, you know, and have a different experience from everybody else. I don't know. It's an awkward one. I mean, I have performed a little bit once or twice, but I'm not sure that. And yes, the experience is totally different, I think. The need to slow down, just being worried and going too fast, and just to realize that my experience of time, because of that, is so different from where from where the audience, whoever's watching, listening. So I that's, Yeah, I find it a hard one, hard question.
It's a strange situation where as performers we set ourselves up to have a different experience of time and then walk into a space pumped full of adrenaline, which is a hormone that's utterly already altered any possibility of our sensing time. But we do it. Rosie, any thoughts about audience?
I love those descriptions. Yeah, I'm not quite sure because I've been a performer and I'd love to be one again at some point. And I'm also sculpting time and trying to give my audience a very particular experience. I'm not quite sure which voice to talk about. So maybe I'll talk about making work for audiences, or yeah, there's so much. You don't know how an audience is going to come to your work, where they're coming from. So I always feel like I need in the first part of the work to somehow slow their heart rate down. I'm actually consciously thinking, how can I help my audience settle so they can see this thing I'm making and enter a similar kind of sense of time to what I would like them to enter. And I suppose we haven't talked about silence and challenge when we were talking about challenge. One of my early pieces was in silence. I can't remember how long it was. It was called Tender Hooks. And it's meant to be tender hooks. I was criticised by a critic that said I couldn't even spell, but I had changed the T, tender hooks, to a D deliberately. But anyway, just making sure people know that. So it was called Tender Hooks, and it was in silence, and I was in a white dress on a white circle of feathers, and I was moving extremely slowly around the circle with very sustained movement that never stopped. It was extremely hard to perform, but with 4 times where I circled my arms extremely quickly with the thought that maybe they wouldn't even see it because it was so fast. So I had to suddenly do this. And I knew I was challenging them. But as a performer, so I've gone back to performing, never mind. I knew I was challenging them, but what I wanted them to do was to sort of be with me in every step I took and in every kind of the feel of the feathers under my feet, a feather dropping off my finger. I wanted them to notice the minutiae of an experience, to notice all the little details. And by slowing it down, almost like zooming in with a lens to look at the hairs on a bee, by taking the music away, stopping the measurement of time, I wanted them to be with me in my experience. So I had to work really hard to do what Ramsay said and not rush and, be grounded and all of that. That's one experience. But sorry, to come back to not performing and shaping time. So 2 works I've made in the last 10 years have been durational and they've been outdoors. And I have wanted for the audience to dwell or inhabit the space and time that they're in. And of course they are. It's just, how can they sit into it to notice the squirrel or to hear the air in the leaves? And this was very challenging because you're taking away a sense of the theatricality of time, the beginning, the middle, and the end, and maybe an interval, and all these conventions of dividing time in a performance. If you take that away and spread it through the day, people are a little bit lost. But in that lostness, I'm hoping they might notice the different timings of the world around them, and therefore be a little bit more into what Kate was talking about, the collective experience of being together here and now with that pigeon flying over, with that siren going, and with that person in the tree singing like a bird. So something about getting them to inhabit time and space with us rather than watch it go by.
Yeah, very nice image. We're going to open up to any questions from people listening in a moment. And again, it worked very well last week to just come in, just just open up your video and ask the question. But if you prefer to type it in the chat, Kerry and I are keeping an eye on the chat. Just while people collect their thoughts, and just another quick question for the three of you. Ramsay touched upon it a moment ago in terms of digital attention and Facebook, social media and attention. So in what ways, if any, might reflective approaches to performance be necessary or offer resistance in this time of digital attention span and neoliberal rapid change? Can we position ourselves as resistant? Are we deluding ourselves to think it makes any difference? Does it matter? Do you have days when you think it matters and when you think it doesn't matter? What are your feelings on that? Ramsay, sorry.
I think it's may have been somewhere in Yves Citon about healing, that it's an experience that having some kind of aesthetic experience that actually heals one from the damage that kind of social media the way it grabs you. So I just offer the idea of healing.
Kate, any thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose I would say that what we're talking about is just drawing on, the older ways, and there being this kind of sense of things that have been there. Certainly with you working in landscape, Rosie, it's like, this is old stuff. This is ancient, and it's not gone, and it's there all the time underneath the sort of noise and fizzle of technology. And so I think it's perhaps what any contemplative practice does, to go and do a yoga class, to go for a walk, I guess I just see it as, I suppose you could see it as resistance, but I just think it's always there, and it's still there.
That's thank you, Kate. That I find that very helpful, that thought, because I do want to believe that what we do offers a form of resistance, but the state of the world is such that it's very challenging for us to hold on to that belief. And then somehow what you've just said, I think, relieves me in that the necessity for those moments outside of self in relation to the rapid time of this moment is going to happen anyway, that I don't need to make it happen or make a claim that I'm making it happen. I'm just joining it. It's there. Rosie, did you have any thoughts about resistance?
Yeah, I like what you said of joining it and it being there. I think I'm trying to sort of help people to get back there pretty quick somehow in my slowness, to be with different, more than human time frames, etc. Although, on another note, there's two. Okay, so there's 50% of me. It's healing. It's wondrous. That's why I'm doing it. And the other 50%, I don't want to be Gwyneth Paltrow. I don't want to be associated with the wellness regime in any way. So there's a resistance to that, to getting labelled into that world of wellness. But there's a deep knowledge that this is human, right, important, and healing. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you for reminding us in a necessary way that nothing we do is outside of the potential to be commercialized and stolen from us in that way. It's a question from Sarah Watley. I'll just read it out. It's in the chat. Regarding resistance, I would like to ask if any of you have views about crip time in terms of its resistance to linear neurotypical sense of time in performance making and performing. Ramsay, did you have any thoughts about that?
So I haven't thought very much about this. I'm I'm aware that Erin Manning has written about this. I suppose that just I think she and Brian Masumi were very interested in kind of theorizing and making sense for people of neurodiversity, and kind of seeing the neurotypical as trying to make people aware that there is something that's neuronormative, and that we don't necessarily need to just accept that. So I think just that the kind of reading that I've done, and sometimes when I've tried, I think I had approached it in some of my lectures with my students, just trying to think about, recognize that different kind of difference, particularly in terms of kind of environmental experience and presumably temporality as well.
Rosie, did you have any thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I suppose I don't go in thinking with those terms, but there's I guess the work that when I choose to make work that is full of a cast of non-professionals and professionals and different bodied people, then I'm absolutely having to work to that timing. So everything has to adjust. So a professional that might take a second to learn something, we have to go at the speed that is comfortable for the person that will take longest to learn something, etc., etc. So in terms of the methods of work, yes, I would definitely be very aware of that and be thinking about it when I'm making work. In terms of the experience of the audience, I really like giving them that experience to see the difference between the speed of different people's walks, the speed of the way they pass through the space. I like forcing that on them to kind of wait, so that the audience in a way has to adjust to different people's timing. So in that sense, I think I'm using that in a way.
Kate?
So I'm a piano teacher, and I teach all sorts of children with all sorts of special educational needs, and every 40 minutes is a different 40 minutes, and the joy of my job is finding how to work with each individual and noticing the different things that different people struggle with within music, be that the reading aspect or certain recognition of sounds, the dexterity, dyspraxia and things like that, coordination in general. It's all so different, and so therefore it all becomes just it's all the same. And so in that I get to kind of just adjust where I am as the teacher. So I feel that is my experience of adjusting time for different processing speeds or whatever it is that a child is struggling with. But it's actually I see it as the job. That's what I do. It's not something I feel I have to necessarily kind of like adjust to. It just is what it is. So that's my response to that.
I have worked quite a lot over the years with two dance artists in Vienna, Elizabeth Loeffler and Cornelia Schur, and they're both wheelchair users. And a few years ago, we co-led a workshop in impulse dance, and Elizabeth did this quite extraordinarily generous thing. And the first day, the first thing we did, she said, "This is a space where anybody can copy exactly how someone else moves. And we spent, I think, 2 hours copying each other. And during this 2 hours, Elizabeth said, the time it takes me to climb out of my wheelchair might be boring to somebody else, but it's very interesting to me. And that comment from Elizabeth was, it had a kind of profound, it caused a profound shift in I think how I perceived time, and not least because it reminded me that I've had 2 hip replacements now, but at that time I hadn't, and my whole relationship to time, even walking, was completely altered by severe arthritis. But there was a kind of gentle humor in her invitation to say, well, okay, attend to me climbing out of my wheelchair. And that doesn't mean that Elizabeth doesn't find it sometimes frustrating, or that she's not sometimes concerned in relation to the audience and that time that it takes her. But at the same time, there was something very liberating about that invitation. Does anybody have any other questions that they would like to share live or over the chat? Just give people a minute there in case there's something somebody wants to come in with. Looking at my other, actually, did any of the 3 of you have questions that you had in your mind that you'd like to address to the other people? Rosie?
Sorry, and Kate, I think there as well, had her hand. You asked us at one point when we were having a little pre-introduction about sort of historically something about it, and it made me think about the 70s, and I wondered if Ramsay might talk about, as a dance historian, difference in timing. Yeah, this sort of and what might have it, because I've started thinking about what influenced us to take time in this way in the somatic practices. I have a few ideas, but I'd love to hear what Ramsay has to say about that.
Could you say it again?
I wondered if you could contextualize the move into somatic practices, into a change of time and measurement of time historically, whether you see other things that might politically or socially might have influenced that happening, why it sort of happened when it did, this Judson and that change of our attitude to time.
And I was quite interested, just going back to the 50s and 60s, I was really interested to see the similarities between things that Feldman and Cage and Brown were talking about in the early 50s. And I think Carolyn Brown, the dancer, was married at the time to was it Earl Brown? Yeah. And so when she was there in some of those very early conversations they were having, and says that Cunningham was there, never said very much, but actually took a lot of notice of it, which I found very, very interesting. And Earl Brown saying, feeling that the kind of the classical music tradition and the European, I suppose, because they were very aware of the kind of American exceptionalism post-war, and that European tradition had nothing of value in it, and they just needed to start again, and hence those practices that started again. and so if that's the kind of legacy that because I think we often don't get we think of Judson as just Cage and not that whole bag of composers, and that legacy. But what happens in the 70s, because you specifically asked about the 70s, there is that there's that move where Steve Paxton and Simone Forti, I think, move out to the farm, move out into Vermont, and you know, there's that kind of communes, whole earth catalogue, and then how that becomes the kind of the early the kind of early computer internet idealism, and then how that becomes more and more kind of captured by commercial interests. So I suppose that kind of I find that kind of trajectory, how a kind of a sensibility that develops in the experimental then is just becomes resituated in that kind of tune in, drop out alternative 70s, and then that becomes a kind of neoliberal kind of consumerism where you can with the computer it can do whatever you want. Yeah. So I suppose I find that a kind of an interesting trajectory. It doesn't it dodges the question of the how the temporalities shift, but maybe they do. Deborah Hay does circle dances where they just play loads of pop music, and they do these different circles and you know and it's a kind of communal. It's a kind of communal experience, which is very different from the sort of minimalism of the 60s, which was quite abrasive. But I don't know. You know, those are my thoughts. But it's great. It's a great question.
Ramsay, I think I remember you once saying to me, when the dancers associated with Judson Church began to use pedestrian techniques, so walking, sitting, standing, then they weren't so busy with the dance techniques they'd grown up with, and then they had more time to be aware of other things, and that was maybe the beginning of somatic awareness. Am I misremembering, or could you say a bit more about that?
This is a famous Steve Paxton quote that, you know, he did lots of pedestrian dances where dancers were just walking and standing still and sitting down, and that out of that he realized that you're never absolutely still. And he says about the in the middle of standing still is the I've forgotten it now. Is it the small dance?
The small dance, yeah.
And so I thought, well, that's the connection there. But then I also felt it with Feldman. You know, that how you actually touch, you know, where the movement is coming from. You know, is it coming from the wrist? Is it coming from the shoulder? Is it coming from your spine to actually play a note very evenly without too much attack? That's a cue for you.
Kate, that was a cue for you.
That was a cue for me. Yes, I was a part of my PhD looked at Feldenkrais in application of, like, in the exploration of embodiment, but in collaboration. So it was part of my toolkit in exploring how I move. And yeah, a lot of it came back to what's involved when I produce this note, for example, like what parts of my body are involved. But then for me, there's a lot of feeling that goes into, like, well, if I'm using that part of the body, it's because I think a certain way about it and then maybe feel a certain way about it, or it's recalling back to certain piano lessons where I was told this, you must always do this, and is there a trace of that in the way that I move? So I suppose when I start to explore the way that I do things, and certainly in a Feldenkrais session, there's something like this kind of little openings of memories that are associated with certain sensations and preferences of movement. And again, this comes back to, like, well, all right, can I involve this in a piece of Feldman, or must there be a separation? Can I invite that bit of memory and emotion into the way I play this chord? For me, to involve it might actually make it more satisfying in terms of getting through the piece of music. Is a listener going to be able to hear all that? No. They're not going to hear it from the chord, but perhaps they'll sense in me the way I play it is more soothing, or is more sewn in. It's more part of the flow. It's not abrupt, it's not abrasive, or it's not fake. I think that's a big part of what drew me to this work in the first place, is fakery, fake movements in piano playing, and how for me I could just see them, and it put me off listening because all I could see was there was like a wall. And fakery means, no, you're over there, I'm here. I'm protecting myself with my fakery because I don't want you to get close, because I'm actually finding this quite scary. So I think that's kind of a lot of, so when it comes back to how I play a note, it's, what's the intention behind me being here right now in order to make this sound, and can I be honest with myself in how I'm actually producing sound, and how much of that is worthy of exploration, and how much of it is interesting.
But is it different when you're playing something from a kind of experimental music? Does that challenge you in different ways that a kind of a more conventional 19th century repertoire doesn't prepare you for? So does it actually challenge you so that you have to think rethink what you're doing?
I think that sorry, can you see me and hear me? Because I'm frozen on my little mini version of myself. So, but right, okay, that's fine.
You're frozen, but it's a good pose. So just continue.
Okay.
Continue talking.
Okay, I'll carry on talking even if you can't see me. For me, I found the challenge in playing the traditional repertoire, and I still do, because there's a lot of shuds that surround it for me, and in my learning, I felt like I wasn't doing those shoulds correctly, and so I found relief in this more open space of contemporary music in general, so including avant-garde music and the whole spectrum of what it's very rich. It's a rich space, and I suppose with experimental music, in my opinion, is that it actually it asks more questions about what this moment could involve. It's an opening. Is experimental music? It's like, what can we find out? But I think there's still kind of expectations that it should be and sound a certain way, because I worry that it's becoming a tradition in a way now, certainly the New York School, and there are expectations of what it should do. And so I still find that it's that stuff, it's the expectation that I find is the challenge. And I would see that, to be honest, in any genre of music, in any sort of age of music, it's when things become slightly historic, we start to kind of think, well, it's that, we sort of pocket it, and then performers have to start doing informed interpretations, authentic interpretations, and suddenly the limits, you can't, it's suddenly not open anymore. And so so that's kind of like, it's a difficult space, because yeah, where is that line? And experimental music was this idea of removal of sort of ego and just allowing sound to be sound and all this kind of stuff. But there's still a body playing. There's still a history that is present that isn't necessarily written into the music. So how do we negotiate that as performers?
Thank you, Kate. That's that does feel like a shift that's becoming possible away from what I grew up with, which was the distanced mode of experimental performance, which actually is still tremendously useful and pleasurable and important, but that I can also ask myself, who am I when I'm making this sound? I just wanted to Mary Price O'Connor left an observation. She said it's a thought, not a question, but so I'll just read that out because the chat disappears in the when we save the recording. And Mary just made the comment that so many people think that musicality is the 6, 7, 8 of being in time. But she said, and her split second is an interesting choice of explaining experiences that we work in the macro and micro of time all the time. This is the important point, that we hold multiple dimensions of time concurrently. And in the midst, it's coming to the end of this second talk on the body and time. It's thank you, Mary. It's a very important reminder that whilst Kerry and I may have very carefully separated some themes, they are all running in parallel and concurrent when we perform. We're just coming to the end of the talk now. Is there anything that any of you wanted to share, or that we didn't touch upon, and or that was important for you when you were reflecting on reflective time before we met? Rosie.
I'm fascinated by what Ramsay said about the fact that it might correspond with the time that they moved out to Vermont rurally. That really fascinates me, because I was part of Bread and Puppet Theatre, which lived as a commune in, I think, Vermont, but I would perform on durational pieces up Fifth Avenue as a volunteer and things like that. So they came out from the countryside, broke bread with people, and performed in New York. And this sense of the folk revival that was also happening for me and Jonathan as young people, I think, was that the 80s or the 70s? Anyway, let's not worry about the exact dates, but I think I was equally influenced by a folk revival in my late teens, and going to the Albion fairs as a young teenager, and being in New York and Judson and the sort of cleaner, drier experimenting. This combination of these two worlds, the sort of metropolitan and the rural, have always been part of what the rich tapestry of, I guess, my life and how I see the work and where I want to place it. So I found that really fascinating. But I was also thinking about Indigenous cultures and their sense of time, because obviously, as who we are in this talk, we're obviously talking about European and Western practices that have influenced us. But certainly in the 70s, we were all reading Zen and the Art of Archery, and there was a kind of move to understand Japanese, particularly traditions and Chinese, Tai Chi, Aikido. There was a sort of different sense of time in those practices that was influencing dance then. And now we're coming back to Indigenous knowledge and trying to value it again. Similarly, in my early time as a maker and dancer, I was reading Chief Seattle, and there was a sort of move to understand different ways of approaching the world around that time. So I just wonder if that's another lineage that has led into the somatic practices developing, and feminism, of course. But it's opening a whole nother can there.
I'm thinking also of the profound influence of Tarkovsky's films at that time.
Absolutely.
And the book Sculpting Time. You used the expression, I sculpt time, and this was, I very much think of him and these these extraordinary films, which not only had long duration but were plotless to a certain degree, and dealt very much with sensations of edited images, the trace of a possible narrative that was always leading you on a journey. For me, that it's not like I make work like that at all. I do things that are highly scored and usually performed at breakneck speed, but nevertheless, the things that influence us can influence us even if they're not reflected in what we do.
We did talk about film. It's true, that was a massive influence for me as well.
Yeah. We should wrap up now, so I just wanted to say thank you to Rosie Lee, Ramsay Burt, Kate Ledger. I certainly have found this for myself a very very helpful reflection on reflection, which I have to confess is something that I also doubt about, even though Cage and Feldman have been such an influence on me, and also somatic work, Judson Church and so forth. But I feel like you very generously just cracked it open again in ways that were making sense for me. Thank you, Kerry Frankson, for being my co-curator and host, and for the people at Coventry University who've helped to set this up. Thank you for all of you who joined us and made generous comments. The next talk is Wednesday the 3rd of June at 1:30 p.m. We're taking a radical change of direction. It will be Pete Shenton and Tom Roden from New Art Club, along with Sally Doughty, and we will be discussing together about comedic timing. So hope you can join us for that, and please spread the word if you think anybody else might be interested. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Hope to meet you, Rosie.
Yeah.